Welcome to Syntax. On this Monday hasty treat, we're going to be talking all about Wes's Hack Week project, which was a receipt printer with JavaScript. This is one of the coolest things. He is posting about it on social. I'm really stoked to get into the nitty-gritty about what it takes to build a receipt printer with JavaScript and why you might want to do that, maybe some of the protocols that were, just interesting things that Wes learned. My name is Scott Tolinski. I'm a developer from Denver, and with me as always is Wes Boss, the receipt printing man. What's up, dude?
Hey, that was a really fun project. So I'm excited people have been asking, I can't wait for the syntax rundown on all the different details on it.
Yeah, it is Hack Week at Sentry, and Sentry is the perfect tool to find all of your errors, maybe print them out as a receipt and have them available for you to see. It's so fun. Sentry is just one of those tools, again, that if your application has errors, which it's going to, it allows you to fix those errors faster and easier and with way less stress than you could without it. So it's an essential tool in my tool belt, and it was long before this podcast was presented by Sentry. So thank you to Sentry. So Hack Week at Sentry. This is our second Hack Week at Sentry. The first one, we had some pretty neat projects. Wes worked on a hardware project again. I worked on a multiplayer text editor. But Hack Week, if you don't know it, at companies is often you get a time to just work on some cool stuff. And maybe it's related to Sentry or your business. Maybe it's just something off the wall, but it should be something interesting and exciting and maybe stimulating you to learn some things. So, Wes, do you want to tell us a little bit about your project, why you made it?
Yes.
What's the deal?
Yeah. Okay. So what I did was I got a receipt printer, which is what you see at a restaurant in a kitchen, or you go to a coffee shop and you buy something and it goes, and it prints out the receipt and they hand it to you and you throw it in the garbage, right? I have always been very curious about how those things work, especially I can remember exactly, I got a receipt from Toys R Us when I was a kid, and the R in Toys R Us was backwards. And I always remember thinking how did they get a backwards R? And now I realize it's probably a Cyrillic character that they threw in there. But I've always been curious about how these receipt printers work. So what I did was I got one, and I decided I'm going to hook it up to Sentry so that when a Sentry issue comes in, it will just automatically print it. And I'll talk about how I got there throughout this episode. So,
what made you pick that as a thing to focus on, given that the parameters of Hack Week are really broad? What made you, I know you said you're curious about receipt printers, but comes to Hack Week and you're like, I'm going to do receipt printers?
I always like poking around with hardware, And I always I've done the drone in the past. Last year I did this on-air sign that's behind me. And I've always thought it was kind of interesting to be able to control stuff that is in our everyday life. My goal is to one day just do a vending machine controlled with JavaScript. And it seems kind of silly to do it with JavaScript, but the beauty of that is you realize, a lot of these things that are out there are all based on standards. And if you can send data via whatever programming language, you can control these types of things. So I thought, all right, I'm going to try that out. The printers, I've done quite a bit of work with the label printers in the past. We did an episode on that. I have the gun that you can scan the label and it will automatically print it. We did a whole show on that, but I've never actually touched the receipt printers. So these printers are all pretty much the same, meaning that they all communicate on a standard called ESC POS. And this is a standard in the point of sale community or industry where you can, if your receipt printer breaks, you can just go grab another one and plug it into your cash register, and it will just start to work because your cash register or your point of sale will just send the same kind of data to your printer, and it will print the same kind of receipt every single time, right? They all operate on either 80 millimeter or I think it's 60 millimeter thermal paper, which I've since learned is very bad for you. I had probably 20,000 people say, link me to a study that this contains BPA.
Really?
And these poor cashiers that are grabbing them all day long.
Yeah. I used to work at Target. I know all about that.
Yeah. So apparently there's BPA in them. And you can buy BPA free paper. So I got 10 of these rolls, and I I printed like all day long for like a whole week, and I only got through a roll and a half. So it's cheap stuff. And the way that it works is that there's no ink in these printers. It simply just gives heat. And if you were to hit it with a lighter, the whole receipt would go black because it's just where the heat is on the thermal paper. So you have the printer, you have your thermal paper in it, and then how you communicate with the printers is really what I was interested in how that works. So these printers can be hooked up via Bluetooth. They can be hooked up via USB. They can be hooked up via serial port, like it literally came with a serial port, or it can be hooked up to the network. A lot of them will have network cards in them, and they'll just like run their own little print server on it. So I've seen a lot of people in the past hook up to them with web Bluetooth or web USB, which is really interesting. But I wanted to do mine primarily server side, so both of those things were not great, even though there are packages in Node for working with Bluetooth and USB. So I just hooked mine up to a hardwired Ethernet connection here, and you press a series of buttons and it prints off the IP address of the printer as well as a port. So right away I got a local IP address and a port, and then you simply just create a TCP socket. In my case, I just used Node.js. I imported socket from the net package.
Wow.
I did try use WebSockets, but that is not entirely a TCP implementation. You can't do TCP from the browser. So I did it all via Node.
Wow.
So you create a socket, you connect to it via an IP address and a port, or you can connect to it via USB or whatever. And then what you do is you start to send that socket data, and that data needs to be formatted in the ESC POS format, which means that there are a number of preset commands for incrementing the font size, bolding the font size, inverting, all of the things that you're used to seeing on a receipt. And that's why if you look at a receipt, generally these receipts all kind of look the same because there's only a limited API for doing things like tables and layout and whatnot. There is a really good package from Niles Lenher, and he's written a whole bunch of packages for working with this type of stuff because I believe he works for or has a company that does point of sale software, like an iPad that you can tip on and it prints a receipt. So he has this package called ESC POS Encoder. And what this will do is it will take you from literally sending hexadecimal bits to the printer, which is, I started with that. I did a hello world, and it will give you a nice JavaScript API for saying like, you create a new encoder and you can do .image and do .text and .invert true, and it will give you all of an API for doing this type of stuff that is fairly sane. Once that's encoded, you simply just take your socket and you say socket I believe it's .send, and you send it that thing, and boom, like the first time I tried it, like I literally just coded something and I tried socket.send and it printed the very first time.
How many times has that
happened? I was just like, ooh, never,
yeah,
absolutely never.
I know there's always something where you click the button, you're like, all right, go. And then you get the console error and you're like, all right.
Yeah. The kind of funny thing about the socket was I actually ran into some issues because I ended up building a React.js or Next.js server components application because I then took it and allowed people to send photos of themselves. So I hooked it up to Get User Media with the webcam. So you go to the URL, you click a photo, and it printed out on my desk. And I was having thousands of people sending me photos, and it was printing off my desk. My whole desk was full of paper. It was really exciting. And then I also allowed people just to type text.
That was gutsy,
and I ran that.
I will say, the photos thing, very gutsy.
The photos thing was very gutsy, and I did not have a single bad thing come through. Can you... Like I probably had maybe 2,000-3,000 images come through, and not a single person sent anything bad. And then
That's
text,
crazy.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say why. I turned it off before it got out of my circles.
Okay, that's why. Yeah,
because the tweet did get pretty popular, and like a couple hours in, like once the anime avatars start getting a hold of it, then I shut it down before it got crazy. But
Shinji's
I did with the
replying
text one. The text one, I ran it through a Transformers.js model that would detect toxic comments. And it was so good. Like you could misspell. I kind of felt bad like typing stuff that was toxic because I was like, is someone going to know that I'm typing these bad words, you know? But I needed to test it. And it would catch almost everything. Like misspelled bad words, negative talk, all kinds of stuff. And it filtered that all out. And I only saw one thing that someone got through. They did ASCII pair of memories, which did not get caught.
For some reason, using the word memories is so much worse than any other word you could have used there.
So that socket, let me come back to explaining that socket, is there can only be one socket connection to this thing at once. So what I had to do is I would take in the incoming connections and I surfaced it via Cloudflare tunnels. And basically people are like, why am I getting Next.js dev server errors when I'm visiting the website? I'm like, because I'm literally working on it right now.
Yeah.
And you're visiting my computer via thing. But like I ran Next.js dev server all night and it had thousands and thousands of people visit it and it held up just fine. But one thing that did not hold up fine was the socket. When you connect to a socket via a server component that is meant to be called from the client side, you know, like RPC, and just a socket that's meant to be called via a server function, it was trying to create two sockets. And I went deep, and Next.js does something weird with two different Webpack bundles for React Server components. So that was a bit of an issue. And you also hit that with databases as well, where you have multiple connections to a database and you can only do one connection. And that's where you get like connection pooling coming in. So I thought that was kind of an interesting learning point of, oh, I can't just spin up multiple sockets. I wasn't, but because the way Next.js works is it was trying to make two connections, and that was a bit of an issue. So once I had hundreds of people printing off images and text, I said, all right, I'm pretty comfortable with how all of this works. I want to actually do what I set out to do, which is make a receipt that shows my Sentry issue. So I thought the formatting on ESC POS is not very good. It's very limited. But what is not limited is HTML and CSS. So what I did is I formatted the entire receipt in HTML and CSS, and I use Playwright to visit the URL, take a screenshot, convert it to an image, and then I took that image and I sent it to the printer, which is something you're allowed to do. So I basically sidestepped the entire ESC POS format, except for the part where you can send images to it.
Yeah, totally.
And it worked really well. Like, I know not everyone can see this, but I like did a pretty nifty little layout of my Sentry issue where I have the ID of the error, I have the actual error itself, I have the cause of the error, like which page is it on. I built a little graph with Flexbox that shows how often it's happened in the last 24 hours and 30 hours, bunch of metadata, which browsers it's happening on, what devices it's happening on, which OS it's happening on. And I feel like I did a pretty good job laying it out, and it looks good. Like if I were to get that, if I was a poor dev and somebody slapped this on my desk, hey, work on this issue, I'd be like, wow, this has enough information for me to make actionable change.
You know what that could use, Wes? Here's my only suggestion. You could have put a QR code on there, scan that baby, and have it take you to the actual Sentry issue, so that way you could like get the rest of the information. Or
I was thinking
mark
that
as resolved.
That's a great idea. And the printers have QR codes and data matrices built in to the printer.
Really? Yeah.
So I wouldn't even have to use a third-party package.
Yeah, and let me tell you, I've done some QR code work recently, and it's just a simple, even if you wanted to use a package, it's just a simple canvas, one function call to generate a QR code. So
yeah, it works well. I did it on my like receipt scanning or label scanning thing in the past. I did have to use the Node Canvas package because obviously there's no canvas on the server.
Right.
But it worked well, aside for some node jip install issues that I hit. Printing images, the package that I use has 4 different dithering algorithms. So if you try to print an image straight away, it will just do black or white and it doesn't look very good. But there's algorithms that will dither the images, meaning that they'll take away and add images and try to make it like faded. And it does a really good job at printing images. I was pretty impressed. Once I had Playwright taking a screenshot and sending it to the printer, the last step was I made a API route that I went into Sentry. I created a new app called Sentry Thermal Printer, and then I set it up so that we have webhooks on new issues or on issues that have been updated, or maybe you resolve them and they come back. And whenever that issue happened, it would ping the webhook, and then I would be able to get the information about that specific issue as well as its status, etc. And I could just basically send that to the printer and it would bring it right on up. And that was the end of my week of working with a thermal printer.
Wow. So all in all, would you say that like the Hack Week project overall benefited you in the long term in any sort of way, or was it just like a curiosity solving thing?
Yeah. So a lot of people were like, but why? You know? And I can't tell you how much interesting stuff I learned. I learned a lot about socket connection issues that could pop up. I learned a lot about how like real stuff works. I learned a lot about surfacing my local computer to the internet without giving my IP address out to everybody. I learned a lot about the Sentry API and the webhook API and how that all works. So I think that sometimes people see these projects as silly and stupid, but when you're having fun, and I'll tell you, I've had tweets from probably 6 or 7 people that have already bought a thermal printer and are doing the exact same thing because it is so fun and it really re-energizes your appetite for building this type of stuff when you can do something that's not your standard like form data updated database. Totally. It's kind of fun. And like even somebody at Sentry, I think is the Seattle office, already ordered a thermal printer
just to get it up and running.
They're going to build like an internal Instagram where you can like send photos from office to office.
That's so cool. See, look, and that's the whole thing. That's the whole thing about Hack Week is that like the projects don't end up having to be like stuff that ends up in the product at the end of the day. And sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they end up being super useful. Like, we'll talk next week about the project that CJ and I did together.
That is something very useful.
Yeah, we'll get a lot of use out of, but we also learned a lot. But at the end of the day, you know, Hack Week is about exploring curiosity, and the results of that can be all kinds of things that you maybe didn't even set out to do. But man, if your company doesn't have a Hack Week, or maybe you're even like a small team or something like that, it's kind of a cool idea if you can find a week or even, 4 days of a week to crunch on some just experimental anything and set out and try to create a project over that amount of time. It was, for me, too, very personally renewing in terms of energetic and like we were able to accomplish so much, and I learned so many different new techniques, and it's really quite the experience.
Yeah, I would recommend it to anybody. If you see, especially these thermal printers, they're about $100, but you can often find them on like Marketplace or a thrift store. The one thing, I was trying to buy a cash drawer with one of them as well, because part of the ESC POS standard is that you can send a beep, and that beep essentially just sends a signal to something. And that something can be a cash drawer, and it goes ka-chunk, it opens on up, which is always fun.
That's hilarious.
So I highly recommend checking it out. I'll post the link to my GitHub with all the thermal printer code. I think you'll be surprised at how relatively simple it is, even though I did like quite a bit of screenshotting and whatnot. But the actual connecting to the printer and sending data to it, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 lines of code.
Amazing. And super cool. So thank you so much for sharing that, Wes. I always stoked to see what you're going to come up with. Whenever we start talking Hack Week, you're like, I think I'm going to do hardware. and then just know it's going to be something wild. So it's always fun.
Right on. All right. Thanks everybody so much for tuning in. We will catch you on Wednesday.
Peace.
Peace.